What if everything you thought you knew about global alliances and rivalries was being actively reshaped by powerful narratives, narratives specifically designed to influence you? Today, we're diving deep into that very question. And to kick us off, here's a really startling statistic. Back in April 1990, just 7% of Russians held a negative view of the United States, a tiny fraction. But fast forward to May 2024, and that figure, it's skyrocketed to 76%.
Wow.
76%. That is a massive shift in just over 3 decades.
It really is. And that dramatic shift isn't just, a curiosity. It's a powerful illustration of how these carefully crafted narratives can profoundly transform international relations.
Yeah.
And even internal politics. So this deep dive, we're going to unpack the origins, the evolution, and the strategic deployment of anti-American and anti-Western sentiments, particularly across Europe and the post-Soviet states.
It's complicated stuff.
Oh, definitely. It's a complex landscape, but by connecting these dots, you'll gain a much clearer understanding of today's geopolitical forces.
Our sources for this, they're primarily from the Ideology and Politics Journal. And they give a fascinating look at this whole phenomenon. We'll explore, the philosophical roots of some critiques, how anti-Americanism became a deliberate state tool in Russia, the really surprising twists with Ukrainian anti-Americanism, and even how these narratives get woven into school textbooks.
Yeah, that textbook part is quite something. Our mission today is really to extract the crucial insights from this material, help you understand what's actually driving these attitudes, and how they shape the global stage.
Okay, let's get into it. Our sources start by digging into some pretty heavy philosophical ideas that sort of underpin how critics view America, and by extension, the West. It can feel a bit abstract at first.
It can, but these concepts are crucial for understanding the deeper currents. Thinkers like Jean Baudrillard, Slavoj Žižek, Giorgio Agamben, they provide a kind of critical framework. And while their critiques often target broader Western modernity, their analysis of the U.S. is particularly relevant just because of America's huge global influence, right, in capitalism, media, governance.
Right. The U.S. often becomes the prime example. So Baudrillard first. He talks about hyperreality and this media-saturated culture. What's the core idea there?
Well, Baudrillard suggested that in our modern world, with media everywhere, the lines between what's real and what's just a representation of the simulation get incredibly blurred. Think of like the Matrix. What you see on screen starts to feel maybe even more real than actual experience.
Yeah.
He argued that big events, even something like the war on terrorism or the World Trade Center collapse, could be perceived through this lens, blurring reality and simulation. He even suggested terrorists might act on the simulation instead of the real. The key insight, really, is that when reality itself feels constructed or mediated, it opens the door for narratives to manipulate our understanding. And that can be a powerful basis for critique.
That is a bit mind-bending, that blurring. And then Žižek takes it further with ideology, right? How does that deepen the critique?
Yeah, Žižek argues ideology isn't just like a false belief we hold consciously. It's embedded in our reality. He actually says ideology is not simply a false consciousness.
Yeah.
It is rather this reality itself, which is already to be conceived as ideological.
So reality itself is ideological.
That's his point. He looks at how ideology underpins American capitalism, how Hollywood blockbusters, The Dark Knight or whatever, reflect and reinforce these dominant fantasies. He famously said 9/11 felt like seeing the desert of the real from the Matrix, a really unsettling idea because it implied the reality we knew was already kind of a screen.
Wow. Okay. And Agamben, the state of exception.
Agamben focuses on how, during crises, health, security, economic, doesn't matter, governments often declare a state of exception. This lets them suspend normal laws, expand executive power, often, he says, at the expense of democracy and basic human rights.
And he saw this becoming more common.
Exactly. He noted it tends increasingly to appear as the dominant paradigm of government in contemporary politics. So taken together, these thinkers offer this comprehensive critique, framing American global power as operating through, simulation, ideology, and these states of exception that can undermine rights.
All right, so that's the philosophical backdrop. Now, let's shift to strategy, because this is where it gets really interesting how these broader critiques get, weaponized. Our sources detail this dramatic shift in Russian attitudes toward the U.S., becoming what they call a stable character of anti-Americanism.
Precisely. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia initially looked west. In 1991, 74% of Russians actually preferred cooperation with the U.S. They saw it as the richest and most developed state.
74%. What changed?
Well, that optimism soured pretty quickly. The shock therapy reforms in the 90s, they led to huge social inequality, hyperinflation. Then came the 1998 global financial crisis, the U.S. intervention in Kosovo, all leading to widespread disillusionment and this gradual cooling of relations.
So the ground was fertile by the time Putin came to power in 2000.
Exactly. And the sources say the government then actively took control of the process of forming and spreading anti-American sentiment.
It became a tool.
A favorite technique, they call it, to play on patriotic feelings and use foreign policy to maintain the legitimacy of the government.
And how did this strategy ramp up?
It really accelerated from 2003, 2004 onwards. You had the U.S. invasion of Iraq, the color revolutions in post-Soviet states, NATO expanding eastward. These events solidified Russia's shift towards asserting hard power, positioning itself as a challenger to American hegemony. Apparently, Putin even considered Russia joining NATO at one point, but they weren't given special conditions, which, well, that contributed to this path of confrontation.
And the numbers back this up, as we said. Negative views jumped from 44% in 2014 to 73% in 2022 after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and hitting that 76% peak in May 2024. That's a 69% increase in negativity since the late Soviet days. Just staggering.
So the critical question is why this is so vital for Russia. Domestically, this anti-American rhetoric, it's a powerful tool, right? To consolidate society around the authorities, decrease trust in Western democracies. Internationally, it helps Russia strengthen its influence, build alternative alliances. They actively promote Occidentalism.
What's Occidentalism?
Yeah, it's like the inverse of Orientalism, portraying the West as decadent, chaotic, morally inferior, to justify Russia's own exceptionalism and its supposed civilizing mission.
And this isn't just aimed at adults. Our sources show it's deeply embedded in Russian education, too.
Yes, and that's a really profound use of education as state policy. Russian secondary school history textbooks actively promote the negative image of the West as an enemy. They follow a clearly defined standard of history, a consistent narrative. And as you get closer to the 21st century in these books, the anti-Western stuff gets more pronounced and categorical, directly justifying current foreign policy.
Can you give an example from the textbooks?
Sure. They tend to minimize the West's contribution to WWII, really emphasizing the USSR's role. One book has this histogram. It shows in 1945, 57% of French people thought the USSR contributed most to defeating Germany versus 20% for the USA. By 2015, the USSR figure is still high at 54%, but the USA is up to 23%, and the textbook asks students to explain the changes. It's subtly guiding them, isn't it?
Yeah, towards a specific conclusion.
Exactly. They also highlight things like the KKK or political corruption in the U.S., presenting them not just as historical facts, but as sort of inherent American flaws.
And what about something like the Marshall Plan or post-war aid?
Well, the Dawes Plan, for instance, isn't framed as assistance. It's presented as a strategic plan to establish its economic and political dominance. The argument is the U.S. only helped Europe to protect its own credits and prevent revolutions.
Turning aid into a power grab narrative and shifting to the current conflict.
Russian leaders, like Foreign Minister Lavrov, they openly call a collective West, led by the U.S., their true foes.
Yeah.
They paint Ukraine not as sovereign, but as swept up into his orbit and manipulated.
Which connects directly to Putin's stated goals.
Right. Demilitarizing Ukraine means cutting off Western support, denazifying links to controversial Ukrainian nationalist figures, accusing the West of tolerating them. Lavrov even claimed Russophobia is rampant in the West, nurtured by government circles, and alleged horrible events like the Bucha crimes were staged by Ukraine with Western help. And social media is key for pushing this propaganda and disinformation.
Okay, so that's the Russian strategy laid bare. But what about Ukraine? This is where our sources show a really surprising twist, a kind of Ukrainian anti-Americanism.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Despite massive American support, some anti-American sentiment persists in Ukraine, but it's different. It's more of an oscillation, not a fixed stance. It's influenced by, history, perceived gaps in U.S. leadership, and obviously the huge existential threat from Russia. It's very dynamic.
The sources call it proactive anti-Americanism, born from disappointed pro-Americanism. What does that actually look like?
It means Ukrainians, feeling, understandably, victimized by Russia's aggressive policy, hope the U.S., the world leader, would be their savior. But when, in their view, the U.S. savior turned out to be strange in its behavior or did not want to fulfill its role as fully as they needed, leaders like Zelensky used public diplomacy, public criticism, even to pressure the U.S.
So it's frustration driving it, not outright rejection.
Exactly. It's an expression of frustration with the inadequacy of the American response. It reflects a deeper desire for strong global leadership and solidarity. Zelensky's statements often criticize what they see as American isolationism, indecision, caution, or even being too oriented towards Russia historically. It's about pushing America to be more involved, ironically.
And he's not shy about it. That comment about a U.S. presidential contender needing to think first, then speak regarding aid, that's pretty direct.
Very direct. And strategically, Ukraine frames its own weakness by its role as a defender of Europe and the entire civilized world. Zelensky has said things like, every Ukrainian life sacrificed is a saved life of our neighbors, Poles, Lithuanians, Moldovans. The goal is pushing for global solidarity, collective action. It makes their fight universal.
Right, shifting the frame. Now, these narratives don't just exist in Russia and Ukraine, do they? Our sources show echoes elsewhere, especially places important to Russia's ambitions, like Crimea.
Crimea is a key example. Even before the 2014 occupation is a hotbed of anti-Western sentiment, fueled by large-scale Russian influence. Pro-Russian groups and media actively created anti-Western sentiments, pushing against Ukraine, joining Europe, pushing for Eurasian integration. They laid the groundwork.
Any specific examples?
Well, yeah. In 2006, there were protests against the U.S. military ship, the Advantage, in Feodosia. Pro-Russian parties blockaded it. In 2008, the USS Dallas was met in Sevastopol with shouts of, "NATO go away, Yankees go home." Polls back then showed very low support in Crimea for European integration compared to the rest of Ukraine.
And after the occupation?
The rhetoric just escalated. Crimean media paints the U.S. and EU as an existential enemy, using old Soviet terms like hegemon, doomed to failure. They depict Russia as this bastion of morality against the sinful West, demonizing things like Halloween as a secret plan against Russia or Valentine's Day as spiritual trash. It's intense.
And then the conspiracy theories.
Right, these wild stories about American biolaboratories in Georgia and Ukraine, even claiming experiments on humans were planned in Simferopol, all designed to intimidate Crimeans and provoke hatred towards the USA.
How widespread are these kinds of narratives beyond Crimea?
Well, our sources show similar stuff in Romania, often spread through this multi-level system. Russian state media, bots, trolls, fake social media pages. You see claims like NATO provoked the conflict, the biolabs thing again, or that sanctions only hurt the EU, not Russia. They also push the idea that Romania lost its sovereignty to the US or EU, pointing to things like an EU court ruling on the supremacy of European law.
And what about places like Slovakia or Serbia?
History and geopolitics play a big role there too. Slovakia's anti-Americanism is maybe more of a pragmatic critique, since they're in the EU and NATO. But Serbia's is described as markedly intense and culturally rooted, especially after the 1999 NATO bombing campaign.
So public opinion there is still largely pro-Russia.
Surveys suggest so, yeah. Despite some favoring balanced relations, the overall trend leans pro-Russia. It shows how effective this top-bottom construction of anti-Americanism via media can be. It's a long-term shaping of opinion.
Okay, so we've mapped out these external narrative battles, but the sources also highlight something crucial happening inside Ukraine, this fight to build a liberal democracy, even during war. That feels important.
It really is. Our sources call this the good news, because despite the war creating a state of exception that naturally centralizes power, Ukraine has actually seen significant anti-patronal transformation.
Anti-patronal, meaning less cronyism.
Exactly, moving away from a system where political power mainly benefits a small circle of loyalists. This is a stark contrast to Russia, where that combination of power monopoly and patronage essentially resulted in the death of democracy, even before the full-scale war.
And this wasn't just a wartime reaction in Ukraine.
No, it started earlier. The 2014 Revolution of Dignity really empowered civil society. You saw a mushrooming of anti-corruption NGOs, initiatives like Prozoro, that digital platform for transparent public procurement. Plus, the 2014 decentralization reform gave more power to local governments. These were real steps.
And President Zelensky's role since 2019.
What's notable, according to the sources, is that unlike past presidents, Zelensky hasn't apparently used wartime nationalization of oligarch assets to just re-privatize them to his own allies. He's reportedly not enriching himself or his closest circle and is pushing normative anti-oligarch measures, even impacting powerful figures like Kolomoisky, a former supporter who faces serious charges.
So tackling the oligarchs head-on, even amidst invasion, They passed a specific law.
Yes, the 2021 Oligarch Act. It defines who counts as an oligarch based on political influence, media control, market dominance, and wealth over $90 million in assets. If you're designated an oligarch, you go on a register and face restrictions. No funding political parties, no taking part in privatizations. It's a concrete legal tool.
But can these changes stick? Can wartime measures lead to lasting democratic gains?
Well, the efforts are supported by institutions like NAB, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, set up back in 2014. They've prosecuted over 1,000 people with a significant economic impact. And ARMA, the Asset Recovery Agency, transferred $1.5 billion in assets in 2022 alone, investing some proceeds in military bonds. These aren't just symbolic moves. Plus, Ukraine's push for EU membership requires adopting EU laws, strengthening the judiciary, fighting corruption. So this internal resilience, helped by Western actors, offers real hope for a long-term shift towards a more liberal, less patronage-based democracy.
So wrapping this up, what does it all mean? We've really gone deep into this complex world of anti-American and anti-Western sentiment today. We've seen the philosophical roots, how narratives become state tools, how they play out in war and education.
Yeah, we've looked at Russia's very deliberate cultivation of these narratives, Ukraine's more surprising proactive critique, and how these ideas echo across other European nations. What this study really reveals is that these aren't just, opinions floating around. They are active, powerful forces shaping international relations and domestic politics every single day.
It really drives home the power of narrative, doesn't it? Whether it's used to build power, justify aggression, or even pressure allies for more support, how stories, true or twisted, shape our world.
Absolutely. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. How do you critically engage with the narratives you encounter every day? And what responsibilities do we all have, nations, individuals, in shaping a more informed, more truthful global discourse? Something to think about. The stories you're told, and who really benefits from you believing them.